I will start talking about Renew and the context within which it's been developed. So it was against the backdrop of the UK Climate Change Act being established and also a number of EU energy efficiency directives. That within that context, the mayor decided to have a target of cutting 60% of carbon emissions by 2025. And more recently, the new mayor of London has committed to have London becoming a zero carbon city by 2050. And in terms of the facts for retrofit in London, we know that 36% of London homes, are responsible for 36% of emissions in the city. And we also know that 80% of those buildings will still be in use in 2050. Also, as the DEX carbon plan actually aims for our buildings to be almost zero carbon by 2050, then within that context, retrofitting those buildings has become a priority for the City of London. That's why Renew was established, first in 2009, and we are now in the third phase of its delivery. It basically helps organizations such as housing associations, boroughs, and universities to implement their retrofit projects. And it does so in this current phase, which is funded by the European Investment Bank and by the GLA. It does so mainly via a free technical assistant team, which is providing end-to-end support to organizations to get their projects up, running, and successfully delivered. And it also does so through a Renew framework of suppliers, which helps organizations to procure the projects efficiently. And so far, the Renew program has helped organizations to support the retrofit of about over 119,000 homes. And per year, it's contributing to save over 40,000 tons of carbon and about 7.9 savings on Londoners' fuel bills. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the Renew support teams. Basically, it's a free technical assistant team which provides free one-to-one support to organizations, and that support is very specifically tailored to each organization's needs. And this support is given in the areas you see on screen, so a number of different areas, and later on George will actually focus on the technical advice that the team is providing, especially in terms of technical risk assessment that the team is giving. And I'll tell you more about the Renew framework of suppliers now. So it's been set up last year in 2015. It's available for 4 years. And it's a purpose-built framework, so it's really specifically designed around the needs of retrofit projects. It is providing support on a number of different project types and scope. So it can provide support to projects including one or more areas of scopes that you can see on the diagram below. It provides also asset management services, and is actually also available for use by organizations and projects outside London. It can also provide pre-agreed terms of contracts, which is reducing the time for clients to contract their projects, and it's a managed framework, which means that it can provide template tender documents and really provide support to organizations through the procurement process and within their ongoing engagement with their suppliers. And before I hand over to George, I'll leave you with just a snapshot of the 63 organizations that Renew is supporting on your left, and on the right you can see the 9 Renew framework suppliers. Thank you.
So what I'm going to talk to you about today is how the Renew support team is helping organisations to manage technical risks. So looking at why we want to do this, why we thought it would be a good idea to have a technical risks toolkit, what it is, how we can use it, and there's also a case study, an anonymised case study, about how we've used the toolkit and the procurement framework together to try and ensure that we're delivering good quality retrofit at scale. So what are we aiming to achieve? First thing, delivering best practice retrofit at scale. And our definition of that is very similar to Russell's definition. And I think it's, as he said, we have lots of really great quality retrofits on a household level or smaller projects. At the other end of the scale, we have huge projects that might be a single measure or done very quickly, and that aren't looking at the dwellings as in the wider context. They're just looking at getting a single measure done, funded quickly, and that's it. And so what we're looking to do is improve quality, also improve scale, which isn't that easy a thing to do. Also make sure that we're getting the full range of benefits from retrofit. And probably it's been said a number of times today that the funding situation isn't particularly great. It's caused a number of issues in the market. It's actually maybe prevented the cause of retrofit from advancing, if you like. And I think that perhaps one of the things that we need to do is understand what the full range of the benefits that we get from retrofit are. So not just the economic savings, both in terms of jobs and cost savings to householders, the environmental ones, which are well documented, but also things like comfort, health, indoor air quality. Because once we start to put together all of those different gains, then we'll start to make a really solid case for investing in this. And that's particularly something we're looking to do with social housing providers that we're working with through Renew. And promoting a whole house approach where possible. So what does a whole house approach mean? Well, it doesn't just mean doing one measure, obviously. It doesn't mean doing all of the measures at the same time, but it means considering what a house needs, what package of measures it might need, and how those can be delivered over time. It also means coordinating energy efficiency works with other works. So, for example, typical example, if you're doing a roof replacement, why not do solar PV? If you're doing a roof replacement in 1 year, but you don't have the budget to do the external wall insulation in that year, then why not make sure that you've got extended the eaves so that you don't have to do that job again when you come back in 2 years' time. It means minimising the technical risks, so making sure that we don't have issues of thermal bridging, condensation, mould growth, making sure that the ventilation strategy is right for the building as well as the energy strategy. And I think perhaps most importantly, making sure that retrofit works for building occupants. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but the number of times where we've had home visitors, for example, going into people's homes and they've come back and said, well, people we spoke to in the houses didn't know how to use the heating controls or didn't know how to use TRVs even. So it needs to work for occupants. So a retrofit needs to be practical, it needs to be easy for occupants to get the most out of, and it needs to meet their needs as well as reducing the energy consumption of the building. Why do we have a technical risk toolkit? Because I think there's plenty of evidence out there that from existing retrofit projects, there's a wide range of unintended consequences that can happen if it's not done properly. So the reason for us tackling this through the Renew programme, it's to help people understanding of what those risks are, identify where they're more likely to occur, and I think perhaps most importantly for us, because there's already a lot of really great stuff out there. You've got the Sustainable Traditional Buildings Alliance, which has done a huge amount in this area, and they've produced some really fantastic resources like the STBA guidance wheel. But what we wanted to do is to help the organisations that we work with identify those risks, but also manage them, understand what the process is that they need to put in place to manage those risks and improve the quality of the work that they're carrying out. So the technical risk toolkit, it has 3 components. The first one of those is 6 fact sheets, which are general information on interstitial condensation, condensation and mould, infiltration and ventilation, thermal bridging, overheating, understanding what those are and where the risks are likely to occur. And then there's a similar set of resources, a number of building fabric measures where we have watch points. So it might be something as simple as for loft insulation, making sure that the loft space is ventilated, before and after the installation takes place. But it's a series of things that you need to take into consideration when you're planning each of those measures. And finally, we have what's called a triage matrix, which sounds like a horrible term, but it's actually something that's really straightforward. And that's simply just a way of understanding what the inherent risk of each measure is and what the risks of combinations of different measures are, so that you can try and, at a very rough level, quantify that risk and understand which projects are likely to be riskier than others and therefore perhaps need greater attention. How the process works, an organisation might come to us with a project. Let's say it's a tower block that needs external wall insulation, new heating system, windows. What we'll do is we'll look at what the combination of measures is using that triage matrix that I've mentioned, and it will provide a figure. If that's a high figure, then we might recommend that they do a more detailed assessment, which might flag up some particular issues for that building, particular junctions that are tricky, or perhaps that there's existing issues with damp and condensation there, or it might highlight that the ventilation in that building is currently inadequate. And then it's over to them really to decide whether through their project they have the in-house expertise to manage that, in which case we might just point them back to the watch points and the fact sheets and also the STBA guidance wheel that I mentioned. If they don't have that, then we might provide some more recommendations for how they might want to manage that process through the project, through design, implementation and handover. So part of that might be providing detail audits. Some of it might be perhaps getting in a retrofit coordinator on their behalf, maybe looking at monitoring and evaluation, running a risk workshop with contractors, or it might go even further, perhaps carrying out toolbox talks with contractors, if that's what they felt they needed. So that's how it would work on a single project. But we don't... hang on. So the triage matrix, that's a bit more of what it looks like. There's a section of it there. So what you have is measures, what the risk of that individual measure is, and then which are the blue boxes there. And the white and green boxes are the risk of that combination of measures. So, for example, we've got loft insulation and cavity wall. So the risk of having those two together is a 2, for example. I'll give an example of how that works on a project. So we've got a block where we're doing communal heating and EWI. This is actually, you might expect more measures. This is just a very simple example. We wouldn't recommend doing EWI necessarily without considering the windows. Communal heating has a high inherent risk because of overheating risk and a number of other things, service penetrations. EWI is a slightly lower one, so what we do is we add up the individual risk of those measures, and then we look at the risk of combining those two measures in a project, which we say is a 3. So you add up that total, the two measures and the combination of the different measures, and then you divide it by the number of measures. So for block A, we've got a total of 8 for 2 measures, which gives us a risk score of 4, which is we deem to be a high risk project. We've done the same then for block B, and block C, that should be, where we've got double glazing, which is a 2, flat roof insulation, which is a 2. The combination of those measures is considered lower because there's no interactions, there's no junction between the double glazing and the flat roof insulation, so therefore that combination is a 0. So we've got a score of 4 for 2 measures, which is a low score. So that's how we'd use it for an individual project. On a much larger scale, we would work with organisations to look at their whole stock. We've worked quite a lot with Parity Projects, Russell's company, and we've deployed their Chrome housing stock analysis on a large number of our Renew projects. So what this will do is identify the most cost-effective measures per dwelling identified through that stock analysis. So that gives us a list of measures for each dwelling. What we can then do is use a calculation to run the triage matrix against each dwelling, and that provides you with a risk rating per property. So rather than just looking at it on an individual dwelling basis, we do that high level quickly to identify which are the dwellings that you need to concentrate on more, and which might require high risk dwellings, which might require more planning, greater resources allocated to them, and might require a bit more care around specification. So that's the purpose of using that on a larger scale. So unfortunately I don't have any facts or figures or pictures because it's an anonymous housing association. This is a project that we've got underway at the moment. This is an organisation which had a minimum SAT target for its London-based properties. It's about 1,500 homes that were below that minimum SAT level. We then used Chrome's stock analysis to identify what the most cost-effective measures were for those properties. And in fact, that then led to revising the minimum SAP score that they were set because of budget constraints. Then we used the triage matrix to identify which of those properties were higher risk. And that's helped us to work with them to develop a specification where they're using the triage matrix as a starting point. And then we've helped them to develop a clear process then for identifying what those risks are, for the contractor then to go back and check those, and then to manage those risks through the installation process. Contractors currently being procured through the Renew framework, although this would work with a number of different approaches. But the onus is then on the contractor, with the supervision of the housing provider, to carry out a survey to check those measures that Chrome's identified, and to check that those, to check the risk rating for that property, and to identify what specific risks for that property there are for those measures. We then require the contractor to come up with a ventilation strategy based on the risk rating. So depending on the combination of measures and the risk rating for that property, they'll be asked to choose from one of eight ventilation strategies. And this is something that Peter Rickaby of Rickaby Thompson came up with initially. And he and Lisa Pasquale of Six Cylinder have worked with us to develop this a bit further for this project. But the idea is that ventilation is an integral part of the retrofit process. So you can't just put on EWI and then hope that you're going to manage ventilation through trickle vents. Actually, if you're going to put in certain combination of measures with a certain risk rating, it will require you to come up with something that's a lot more robust. So it's standardising things to an extent, but it's still making sure that quality is there in the project delivery. The installation needs to be carried out to a fairly tight specification, and I think that when we talk about creating the market for retrofit, this is something that social housing providers can really go a long way to solving some of the issues through really decent quality specification, and also making sure that QA processes are in place. We generally recommend that each contract should have a retrofit coordinator. Ideally, you'd want to have one both on the client side and on the contractor side. Handover, absolutely crucial, so we've put in quite a few things in the specification about what should be done for the handover, but I'm going to talk a little bit more in a minute about advice and the importance of that. And then after the first 200 properties, we have a break put into the project, so we're not going to do them all in one go. Do 200 properties first, check that the process works, check that tenants are happy with the works that are being carried out, we don't have any snags or particular issues, go back, review those, resolve any issues that we have, and then use those learnings to inform the second phase of the project. So that first part of the project, that first 200 properties, is in a way a pilot, but it's not a pilot in that we might be accustomed to see in a retrofit project where it's a exemplary property, single one which has all sorts of bits of kit put into it. This is a pilot of doing things at scale and then learning and going on and doing things at a much greater scale after that. Some lessons that we've had from another project that's been completed, also delivered through the Renew framework, really highlights the importance of providing good advice. And we've talked a lot about quality, of getting the work right to minimise technical issues. But I would say that good quality advice for tenants is equally important, and it's a really different skill set actually. You know, you can get people that understand different trades, you can get people who can understand what a dwelling needs in terms of the measures, but the ability to go and talk to lots of different people, relate to them, and relate what's actually quite a complex situation in terms of the energy performance and ventilation of a house, and get people to then act on that advice. It's a really specialist skill set that I think is perhaps neglected a lot of the time when we talk about retrofit projects. And I think this is kind of illustrated by some of the findings from a recent project that we had. 90% of people didn't understand how their boiler worked. 80% didn't understand how TRVs work, which is astonishing, I think. But I think it really helps to highlight the issues that we have when we go in and put new kit into houses. It really needs to consider how people are actually going to use new bits of kit, and simple is usually better. 70% didn't understand central heating controls, and over 70% had never switched fuel supplier, which is a wider issue, but some of the advice organisations that we've worked with will work on the basis that actually it's a bit of give and take with a tenant. If you're going to encourage them to do some things, use their fans, use ventilation, not switch things off, then there needs to be something in it for them. So if you can provide a really high cost saving through switching fuel supplier, then it might encourage people to then go and not switch off those extract fans when they're supposed to. So some guidelines around specifying advice. Most important thing for me is making sure that the advice is provided by someone that's really experienced in doing it, and not leaving it just to a boiler installer who goes in, does the controls, commissions it, hands it over to someone and says, oh, here are your switches. I think it's really important that it's somebody who, well, it could be, you know, a plumber, it could be a boiler installer, but they need to have that experience of providing advice to people and relaying information about energy performance in a way that is really accessible and understandable. We found generally that carrying out an advice visit works much better after work's completed. I mean, that's fairly obvious, but I think in a lot of retrofit programs we've seen to date, the advice is given by the DEA or at the beginning of a project, and there's not much attention paid to handover. Advice really needs to cover ventilation as well as energy, and I think a lot of people don't understand how moisture accumulates in their homes. We did a training session recently for a number of building surveyors who are working on for a social housing provider on ventilation and advice around ventilation. And I think the thing that most of them got out of it wasn't necessarily relevant to their work, but it was actually they understood how to manage ventilation and moisture build-up in their own home, actually. So I think there's a lot of ground to be made up in terms of awareness of ventilation, the importance of it, and how to mitigate the build-up of moisture. So it's really important that advice doesn't just cover energy, it covers moisture and ventilation. And finally, leaving behind material to reinforce advice. One of our framework contractors has done quite a lot of work in developing materials to leave behind, not just a leaflet, but going to the extent of laminating a sheet, sticking it with a magnet to the boiler. Therefore, you know, when someone has an issue with the boiler, they can have some nice, clear advice there for them. So those are some of the lessons that we've learnt from Renew so far, and that's the end. If there are no burning questions, I think we'll take any others at the end. Thanks.